Hello and welcome to Dialogue. The United States and European countries have imposed economic sanctions in response to Russia's recognition of two regions in eastern Ukraine. At the same time, Russia's parliament has approved President Putin's request to use military force outside Russia. Will the West's response pressure Russia to back down? Are we expecting a full-fledged war over Ukraine? Is a peaceful solution still possible? To discuss these questions, I'm joined by independent current affairs commentator Anna Tangen, Cui Hongjian, director of the Department of European Studies at the China Institute of International Studies, and Moscow-based journalist Dmitry Alexander Symes. That's our topic. I'm Xu Jinduo. Welcome to the show, gentlemen. And I will start with you. In response to the recognition and, of course, the peacekeeping force from Russia into these two regions, Donetsk and Luhansk, President Biden gave a speech. He talked about, he called it the beginning of an invasion, quote unquote. So, what's your take on that? Is he or is the U.S. expecting a full version of an invasion?
Well, I mean, obviously Putin has committed troops in there. He's calling them peacekeepers. The U.S. say it's a foreign army. The fact is that these two regions broke away from the rest of Ukraine when there was a putsch, when they deposed the former elected leader, because they thought, or some groups thought, he was too close to Russia, not close enough to Europe. So yes, they're rebels, but you could actually term it that the other way around, that the rebels are in fact the current Ukrainian government. So from Moscow's point of view, it's a different game entirely from that of the West, who has said, well, since they went the way we like them to, it's fine. But in terms of troops, yeah, he's there. It looks very clear that he is committed to either getting what he needs in terms of security guarantees vis-a-vis NATO, or he's going to create a buffer state. And how large that will be is the question.
Is the question. Hongjian, do you agree? Do you think the West in general expected the actions from the Russian side?
I think it's very interesting for hearing from President Biden to say it's just the beginning of an invasion. As you know, the reason is now for United States and the European countries, they try to define what's an invasion, and then because it's related to the scale and the degree of sanction. Mm-hmm. Also, because there is a precondition for kind of a massive sanctions imposed by Western countries against Russia is to define what's a military or violent invasion. Mm-hmm. So I think at this moment, as we know, President Putin to recognize these so-called two republics in eastern part of Ukraine, it gives a very, out of expectation from the Western countries. Mm-hmm. So how to deal with this issue? I think I find out the more weakness indeed from
the Western side.
Certainly, mm-hmm. To have a more category or multi-level of invasion. Even if we go back to several days ago, President Biden had another kind of description of how could we define the invasion? Is a movement into the Ukraine in a small group or big group?
Minor incursion.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So I think it gives
half pregnant.
Yeah.
So I think a weakness of this Western country at this moment. So not only because of they do need to take care of the, especially the response from Ukraine, and also very big question for Western countries is, once there are some tougher attitudes or reaction from mm-hmm. Russia, mm-hmm. how about the space, or how about the benchmark for the Western countries, mm-hmm. especially I think finally there will be more and more divergence between European countries and United States.
Right now, they try to put on a show of unity for sure. Dmitry, our Moscow-based journalist guest here, also in Russia, basically, Russia denies any plan to attack his neighbor, but the parliament just approved President Putin's request to use military force outside Russia. What kind of signal is that?
Well, there's one very important point to keep in mind. After some initial confusion, after some initial back and forth, Putin made clear last night that when Russia's talking about recognizing the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, they're not talking about their de facto borders. They're talking about their proclaimed borders, which currently are de facto controlled in large part by the Ukrainian government forces, because the demarcation line was set following the military engagements in 2014 and 2015. But when these people's republics were proclaimed initially, they encompassed the entirety of the Donbas region, the entirety of the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts. And as a result, this means that there's two options. Either the Ukrainian government forces will withdraw from these regions because Russia has said that they're coming in to protect and establish the borders of these self-proclaimed republics and secure their independence, or Russia will have to undertake military action to push the Ukrainian forces out. Last night, Putin said that there's no sort of specific deadline for the introduction of these Russian forces, and he said that he would prefer to resolve the issue about where the boundaries of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics are for negotiations. But I think we can all understand that if Zelensky were to basically pull out Ukrainian forces out of those regions, that would be politically devastating for him, and I'm not sure he has the capital in order to do that.
Well, Dmitry, a follow-up question. Is that the end game or the ultimate goal for President Putin? Let's say we want this official demarcation of the two republics.
Well, I think his speech earlier this week was quite revealing, because if it were just about the Donbass, it would have been a speech narrowly focused on what happened in the Donbass in 2014 and what's happened since. But instead, he gave a very broad historical overview about the nationality problem in the Soviet Union, the formation of Ukraine as a nation state. And he made the argument that Ukraine, as it is presently constructed, will be a threat to Russia, and that as a result, Russia is forced to take drastic action. And we also see that the diplomacy in recent months has focused not just on the Donbass, not just on the Minsk agreements, not even just on Ukraine, but on the issue of NATO expansion in Europe. And so it would seem to me that pretty surprising reversal if after all that Putin said, we're going to stop simply at Donetsk and Lugansk and not an inch further. I think that what we're seeing right now is a preliminary step. It is trying to see, what the reaction of Ukraine and what the West is. But I think that when you have amassed a significant military force on the border, when you brought in troops all the way from eastern Siberia and the Far East into Belarus, you're not doing that just for some piecemeal negotiations. You're prepared to take potentially drastically more action.
Mm-hmm. Well, speak of a drastic action, and obviously, from the very beginning, the negotiation between Russia and NATO, between Russia and the U.S., Russia has made it, I would say, crystal clear that is that NATO expansion is a problem, and we see that as a threat. So we want there's a no to Ukraine's NATO membership, and also probably withdrawal of some military infrastructure from some of the NATO countries in the Eastern European area. He also, in his speech, talked about the U.S. could deploy ballistic missiles that could reach Moscow in 7 or 8 minutes. I mean, in a sense, that's a legitimate concern about its national security, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the U.S. had the same concern with Cuba, and they almost went to nuclear war over it. So this is not something that's theoretical to the Russians. They feel very strongly that Baker, who was then the Secretary of State, promised them that there would be no going into what was the former Soviet Union in terms of the EU and also NATO. And never mind whether he had the power to promise that, the issue at the time was they took it on face value. And as a result, in 2007 at the Munich Security Council, I remember that famous speech by Putin. He laid it out. He said in 24 minutes, he said, look, this world order, you've lied to us, it's dominated by the US, and it's there to contain us, and we don't like it. So ever since that period of time, ever since 2007, you've seen a very, very steadfast march towards, resurrecting not Soviet power, but Russia's power, and trying to pull back what they believe is in their interest. Now, historically, if you look at Russia, Russia has always wanted buffer countries between it. It does not want a major power on its doorstep, with a shared border. They always want to have some intervening country in between. So maybe creating an East Ukraine is what he thinks will do that, but this is not going to be easy. And I would agree with Dmitry when he says that we just don't know how far this is going to go. I mean, theoretically, if you look at the map, that river that runs down the eastern side, where Kiev is on one side and the rest, that could be what he's aiming for.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hongjian, obviously, I mean, the NATO expansion, eastwards expansion itself is, I wouldn't call it like it's based on full consensus, inside the U.S. or in European countries. For example, George Kennan, that George Kennan famous long telegram, he wrote a piece in 1997, basically on New York Times. He said that the continuous expansion would be a problem, would be an error actually, and now it proves to be so. Despite, of course, Blinken would say, NATO is a defensive alliance.
Mm-hmm. We do have a very popular words about his self-done, doctrine. I think this kind of to analysis nationality of Russia, just like you mentioned, Mr. George Kennan, to say that the expansion is in the nature of Russia, so we need to do something to stop it. So perhaps it will be used by NATO or by the Western countries to prove that legitimacy of NATO. So I think it's a kind of a puzzle to say that you are right, I'm wrong, but as verse. I think now the question is for the relations between Russia and the Western countries is both sides is try to change the discourse and also to take control of the discourse. For example, if we go back to the past, just like my friends mentioned that if we go back to 1997, different situation, but how about now? Mm-hmm. So I think the question is, for both Russia and the Western countries needed to try to get some more consensus. Once we have some more maybe space for negotiation, is how could you keep a balance between this international law, international rule, and also the current situation or the reality, or even the changing world, unchanged or changing. How could you keep a balance? For example, if we go back to, just like Russian claimed, go back to history totally, I think it's also out of the realistic.
Possible.
Yeah. No. If we just keep the situation, or just, for example, the membership of Ukraine, certainly once it happens in the future, it will maybe, once something happens in that way in future, I think at this moment, President Putin tell you that once something happens in that way in future, we have to go back to the past.
Again, so it's like, international order somehow become chaotic in that sense. So, Anna, now U.S. and European countries are imposing sanctions. But do you think are those sanctions enough somehow to pressure the Russian side to back down, to withdraw troops from Ukraine? Or?
Well, no, they're not. And quite frankly, they're trying to hold some of these, what they intend to do. Really, what it comes down to is they're going to drop the finance bomb. They're going to basically ban all Russian banks from transacting through the SWIFT system and things like that. And that's the ultimate threat they have. Now, remember, this is new to Russia. Russia's been under sanctions these many years. I mean, you want to talk about sanctions and how useful they are? Look at Cuba. Look at Iran. So many countries around the world have weathered Washington sanctions, yet they seem to always believe that this will change things around. They always try to use the South Africa as an example of sanctions, but it wasn't the sanctions that brought about the end of South Africa. It was the people inside. South Africa. So at this juncture, it's asymmetrical. You have boots on the ground with arms versus bankers in cities, far and wide, saying that they're going to do something which has not worked before.
Speaking for like asymmetrical, there's a lot of talk from Washington, from Brussels, from European countries. We stand with you, with the Ukrainians, right? They even supply some of the weapons, but at the same time, we all understand that those weapons, those military assistance, is basically, I would say, of little assistance compared to the super military power of Russia, right? There's no balance.
There's no balance except for the fact that you could have a situation where if they start guerrilla warfare, especially in the cities where it's much harder to use tanks in your superior numbers, that could be a real problem. I mean, there's no question that the force he's assembled could do what he wants in terms of settling these border issues with the breakaway republics. But taking all of Ukraine, almost impossible. They couldn't even garrison it.
Right. Dmitry, speak of the sanctions, how biting are they? Russia has been sanctioned by the US, I think, since like 2011, probably like 100 times, and they are handling pretty well. Are they psychologically ready, prepared, for US sanctions, right?
Well, I think Putin late last week made a very revealing statement. He was asked, what he expects from Western sanctions, and he said that even if Russia does absolutely nothing in Ukraine, the United States and Europe would find some other reason to sanction Russia because, and I quote here, the purpose of Western sanctions is to slow down Russia's development. And it's important to note that this is a comment that he has made on several occasions. So I'm inclined to believe that he genuinely believes this. And so the thinking in Moscow, from what I can see, is that whether or not Russia takes, crosses the Rubicon and goes into Ukraine, they're not going to improve relations with the West. The West will continue to impose new sanctions, and that sanctions, and for that reason, are not viewed as much of something to be considered, to be viewed as a deterrent, because they're going to happen either way. Now, in regards to your specific question about the impact of sanctions, there's two ways Russia can mitigate sanctions. The first is by relying on its financial reserves, which it has been building up since 2014. Russia, as of now, has about $640 billion in financial reserves. If I'm not mistaken, that's the fifth largest in the world. And what that means is that, first of all, the Russian government, in the event of sanctions, will have enough money for a prolonged period of time to meet its financial obligations. And on the second hand, it also means it has some resources to do stimulus spending in order to keep the economy more or less stable. Now, obviously, sanctions against banks, potential exclusion from SWIFT would be painful for Russia because it would limit Russia's business opportunities. It would put serious pressure on the ruble. But I don't see much evidence that this would be something critical, that this would be something that could bring about financial collapse of Russia or any sort of political revolution, any sort of elite coup, because along with the building of financial reserves, we have also seen the Kremlin consolidate control over the political system in recent years. And what we saw from 2014 is that sanctions actually help consolidate the Kremlin's control over political elites, because if political elites aren't able to store their money in London, if they're not able to buy financial assets in France, that means they have to keep them in Russia, in which case they will be easier to control by Russia's security services and the Kremlin.
Okay, on a specific case, of course, Germany basically has suspended the project Nord Stream 2, which is, controversial previously. There's a response from Russian senior official, former president, I would say, deputy chair of the Security Council of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, he tweeted, "Welcome to the brave new world where Europeans are very soon going to pay 2,000 pounds for 1 cubic meters of natural gas." Tell us how impactful that could be. Dmitry, yeah.
To me, well, Nord Stream 2 is a very strong example of one of the sanctions that would cause collateral damage because Germany embarked on Nord Stream 2 as part of its larger green energy transition, where it cuts down coal and moves towards more carbon-friendly forms of energy like natural gas. And the Nord Stream 2 pipeline was supposed to double the amount of gas, Russian gas, that Germany received. Now that's gone. And it's not quite clear to what extent Germany and Europe as a whole can substitute this gas. Because, for example, there's been a lot of discussion about liquefied natural gas. Well, in recent days, one of the largest producers of liquefied natural gas in the world, Qatar, said that they would not be able to significantly increase their shipments to Europe because they already have significant contractual obligations to customers in Asia. And indeed, if we think about what we saw several months ago when there was a serious energy crunch in the world, part of the reason why Europe had to, go knocking on Gazprom's door and say, hey, could you please increase your shipments of natural gas, was because all of the world's LNG suppliers in bulk were headed towards Asia because they could get more beneficial prices there. So Europe will be able to, so canceling Nord Stream 2, unpleasant for Russia, but Europe will also suffer as a result.
Well, so President Putin also said, because of recognition, because of what happened, and he said, like, Minsk agreement is gone, or is long gone before this. And then there's a cancellation of planned talks between President Putin, President Biden, and also their foreign ministers this week, actually. So what's the next?
Well, the next thing is what we've been talking about. Exactly how far does Putin go? He has troops in these breakaway publics. He said he's going to be looking at, where the boundary lines are and things like that. He says it's up for negotiation. But that's going to be a military. This is when I say this is asymmetrical. I mean, there's nobody except the Ukrainian army there. And they're in danger because if they confront him coming from that side, if you take a look at the positions around them, they have Crimea to the south, they have to the north, they have Belarus, and they would be in danger of being trapped and then attacked from behind. So, I mean, he's clearly understands military tactics, and what he's done is made it almost untenable for the Russians to fight en masse in that area safely. I think what he would love to do is see them retreat behind that river and in essence give up that land and then start negotiating with him.
Mm-hmm. Well, Hong Jian, obviously the Ukrainian President Zelensky, he was basically pleading at the Munich Security Conference, give us this NATO membership, or truly give us some true assistance instead of talking emptily. And then he said it's a time to test who is a true partner. Are there true partners for Ukraine?
Yes, now it's a time for testing who is a true partner for Zelensky government, also for Ukraine. As we know now, it's also pressure from Russia on this issue. We can find out at the first time the Ukrainian government called for a kind of support from its partner. But firstly, how could what kind of expectation of the support? Yes, some countries.
Are they going to send their troops like?
Yes, send some more troops.
No, yes.
And also provide more weapons. It's a real support. Maybe to some degree, it's pushing Ukraine into the front line, and fighting with firstly, how to deal with the eastern part, two states, and then perhaps very, very high risk, risky, situation is the face-to-face between the Ukrainian army and the Russian army. So, which kind of a real support? So, according to my understanding, now what Ukrainian government needs most is more and more diplomatic solution. Once there will be some more, even now, yes, somebody said that, okay, there is no Minsk agreement and no any basis for more diplomatic solution. No, I don't think so, because anytime, anywhere, always diplomatic solutions, diplomatic exchange would be the top option for Ukraine, not only, and for all sides.
But Anna, do you think the West, the US, or the Europeans will say, you know what, okay, we will make a promise, probably there's no NATO membership for Ukraine?
If you're Putin, would you accept that? I mean, we said in the U.S. we said we go by the Kyoto Protocol, then the Paris Protocol, and then we withdrew from them. I mean, there's a real reliability issue. Can I count on you to follow through? And this is the real danger here. We're talking about this in terms of these things, but right now the fabric of the international community is being, shredded, because nobody trusts anybody else. The only way you can have an international agreement that the UN works is when there's a modicum of trust and people can rely on each other. What we've seen is the U.S. is complaining about other people doing it, yet it's been the U.S. who started the wars without fabricated bases in Iraq and the WMDs that never appeared, Afghanistan. There have been so many. So the U.S. does not walk away from this as the white knight. It was the U.S. who started, tampering with the international order, destroying trust, destroying reliability, and now they're in essence reaping the whirlwind.
Well, Dmitry, obviously there's also a global impact. If you take a look at the oil, for example, the prices is moving closer to $100, or even higher, probably a barrel. So, tell us how long it will impact the global economy, or in particular the energy sector, or to what a degree. Yeah.
I think what we're seeing is pretty unprecedented because because of this potential sanctions being discussed. I'm not talking about the sanctions imposed so far. I'm talking specifically about the sanctions from hell put forth by Senate Democrats and endorsed by the Biden administration in the case of a full invasion of Ukraine by Russia. I'm talking, about sanctions against largest banks, potential exclusion from SWIFT, so on and so forth. These sanctions against an economy of Russia's size would be unprecedented because we've seen similar sanctions be taken against Iran. We've seen similar sanctions against North Korea and Venezuela. But Russia is one of the world's top energy producers, both oil, natural gas. It's the world's largest grain exporter. It has a significant market share in rare metals, for example, palladium, which is used for semiconductors and chip making. So this would undoubtedly, sanctions against Russia, it would hurt Russia, but it would have broader global ramifications. But one of the things, since you asked specifically about the energy market, one of the things I think that you would see is an even greater push by Russia to shift its energy exports from Europe to Asia. And since you brought up Nord Stream 2...
Well, we have to end there, Dmitry. Thank you. With that, we come to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app or on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thank you for being with us. See you next time.